Why can children diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder focus perfectly fine on tasks they enjoy doing? If the problem they have is indeed an internal problem, a shortcoming in their brains that hinders their ability to focus, then why does their ability to focus vary depending on what external activity they are doing? A child with ADHD can focus perfectly well on tasks they enjoy, like reading a favorite book, practicing at dance class, helping a parent bake cookies, or learning deeply about advanced mathematics, as the 6-year-old Jacob Barnett did effortlessly, even though in school he was suspected as having ADD, ADHD, or even autism, and placed in special ed courses. Today, Jacob is a mathematician and astrophysicist with a higher IQ than Einstein, who enrolled into college at the age of 12, skipping 7 grades and learning the majority of his school's math curriculum in 2 weeks. He couldn't focus on the rigid, predetermined curriculum at school, but he could focus on mathematical concepts that most college graduates can't even understand. So was there a problem with Jacob? Or was there a problem with Jacob's environment, specifically his schooling environment? According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, ADHD is classified as a psychiatric disorder, a condition within the mind of a child. But how could any rational, intelligent person say that Jacob Barnett, who now teaches classes to college students at the age of 15, has a psychiatric disorder that inhibits his ability to learn? Technically, we all have ADHD. If you've ever been bored and had trouble focusing, like when listening to a friend tell a boring story or reading a book that wasn't very good, your brain in that moment contains the same qualities of someone with ADHD. That's right. There is literally no difference between what your brain looks like when you're bored and what your brain looks like if you've been diagnosed with ADHD. In reality, ADHD is nothing more than being bored or not stimulated enough by whatever task you are performing. Notice the word stimulated. In this context, stimulated simply refers to whether or not something was exciting or interesting enough for you. For Jacob Barnett, pondering advanced astrophysics is something he would call stimulating. The word unstimulating simply means boring or not worthy of your attention. For Jacob, even though he was a child genius, he was suspected of having ADHD and even autism because he was not stimulated enough by the boring, mundane tasks at school. Which is incredibly ironic because guess what kind of drug is prescribed to children who aren't stimulated enough by school? They are prescribed stimulants. That's right. Ritalin, one of the most common drugs used to treat ADHD, is a stimulant. At the moment, although psychiatrists admit they don't know the actual cause of ADHD or even how Ritalin works to treat it, they theorize that it has to do with dopamine levels in the brain, specifically a deficiency of dopamine, meaning there's not enough of it in the brain of an ADHD patient. Dopamine is a stimulant, and the theory is that children suffering from ADHD are not stimulated enough by their environment and the tasks they perform, and thus by increasing the amount of stimulant in the form of dopamine, they will then be more stimulated and thus interested and capable of paying attention to the tasks they must perform. So in essence, psychiatrists are trying to solve the problem of school not being stimulating enough by drugging up children with stimulants in order to artificially get them excited and paying attention to school or whatever other boring tasks they have no interest in. For Jacob Barnett, his mind was so beyond the mundane tasks his school forced him to do that he was not sufficiently stimulated or excited about them. This means that if his parents would have allowed the psychiatrist and the school to have their way, they would have drugged Jacob up with stimulants, thus lowering Jacob's high standards for what made him stimulated and excited, which was advanced math and astrophysics, and thus he would have stayed content accomplishing mediocre tasks in school and never have evolved his capacities to such advanced levels. Could you imagine if psychiatrists had gotten their hands on Albert Einstein when he was young, before he came up with general relativity and E equals mc squared? How many child geniuses are out there right now that are being drugged out of their genius? The bizarre thing is that even ADHD researchers themselves admit that being bored is a root part of what it means to have ADHD. Leading researcher Dr. Nora D. Volkow, MD, has long studied the relationship between the stimulant drug dopamine and this learning disorder. Dr. Volkow, who once pioneered a research team investigating how Ritalin works in ADHD patients, said, quote, "Dopamine is not only involved with movement and attention, but with reward and motivation. It modulates brain signals that say, 'This is important, pay attention.' So we think Ritalin highlights the task the child is doing. If you are bored, I cannot get your attention. But if you are interested, I can. Ritalin is in this way improving the performance of the child." Wait, what? Let's read that again. Quote, "If you are bored, I cannot get your attention. But if you are interested, I can. Ritalin is in this way improving the performance of the child." Well, of course. The very definition of being bored is to find something so uninteresting, so unstimulating, that you choose not to pay attention to it. In essence, Dr. Volkow is saying that people suffering from ADHD are bored, but if we can give them dopamine, a drug that acts as a stimulant to artificially stimulate them into caring, then they will finally be able to pay attention to things they find boring. Well, there it is. ADHD is nothing more than being bored. In fact, you could even translate attention deficit hyperactivity disorder to mean bored and want to move around disorder. Attention deficit is a fancy way of saying bored and can't focus on it. Think about it. Attention deficit. What psychiatrists in schools fail to understand is that a deficit of attention is relative to each individual and their interests. If you were reading a book that had a boring story and it caused you to have trouble paying attention, would you say you had a psychiatric disorder known as ADHD and had to take a drug called Ritalin, which is chemically related to dopamine, which is chemically related to cocaine, to cure your boredom? Of course not. We don't pop a couple of pills for ADHD and then keep reading the crappy book. Instead, we put the book down and leave a negative review on Amazon.com. In normal conditions, when a person is bored, we accept and admit that whatever we are doing at that moment is, well, boring. It doesn't excite us, it's not one of our hobbies, we're not passionate about it, etc. But when it comes to our children, who are helpless and are forced to comply, we call their boredom ADHD and give them Ritalin for it so they can sit still and pay attention in class. Was child genius Jacob Barnett, who was bored by the simplicity and irrelevancy of his regimented schooling environment, a victim of a learning disorder in his brain? Or was he just too smart for the boring, mundane nature of school? Are children with ADHD incapable of learning? Or are modern schools incapable of providing stimulating, meaningful learning curriculums and environments? Even mainstream psychiatrists accept the concept known as low arousal theory, which states that people with ADHD act out with excessive activity because they are not interested, excited, or sufficiently stimulated by school chores or other tasks they find boring. The obvious insanity, however, is that low arousal theory can basically be translated to bored theory. It's just another fancy term for being bored, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. To barely be aroused by a task is to be bored. To be barely aroused by a bad book is to be bored. To be barely aroused by a mundane, regimented schooling curriculum is to be bored. This is just another example of the psychiatry industry taking everyday, normal facts of human existence, giving it a fancy name, marketing it as an illness, and then providing the cure in the form of a pill. Of course, detractors will say that there's a big difference between the average person being bored by a bad book and a child being bored by school. But this view is flawed, because it assumes that school must be a good thing, and thus, any child who doesn't like school must have a problem, instead of considering the possibility that school might be the problem. Because in the case of Jacob Barnett, he wasn't incapable of focusing in school because he had a learning disorder and was doomed to failure. He couldn't focus because his mind was literally light years ahead of the mundane, repetitive tasks he was forced to complete in school. It's not that he wasn't good enough for school, it's that school wasn't good enough for him. And this might even be true with most, maybe all, ADHD patients. It's not like Jacob is a rare isolated case. There are countless examples of people diagnosed with ADD, ADHD, OCD, ODD, and even autism, which Jacob was also diagnosed as being, who grow up to be geniuses and creative extraordinaires. Professor Michael Fitzgerald, MD of Dublin's Trinity College, examined the life of notable achievers including Thomas Edison, Kurt Cobain, Oscar Wilde, Lord Byron, Jules Verne, Pablo Picasso, Mark Twain, and others, and found that all these high achievers had or displayed symptoms of ADHD. To quote Professor Fitzgerald, people with ADHD have symptoms of inattentiveness, but they also have a capacity to hyper-focus on a narrow area that is of particular interest to them. Clearly, ADHD is not a guarantee of genius, but the focused work rate that it produces may enable creative genius to flourish. Is it possible that ADHD is actually a sign of genius, but our outdated school system, which seems more interested in training children to be obedient than anything else, is suppressing their genius? Giving a child ADHD medication to focus on school is like taking ADHD medication to focus on a boring book. You don't drug yourself because a book or a movie or a date is boring. You just stop dating the person and find someone who matches your interests. But you see, this is the core of the problem, isn't it? Psychiatry is approaching children with the presupposition that they are somehow inherently, internally flawed. Instead of considering that maybe their environment is flawed, maybe what we force our children to do is flawed. Some might say that's not possible because school is important for people's futures, so of course they should be forced to endure school even if they don't like it. Well, that doesn't make much sense when you consider that most people forget most of what they learn in school. It's common knowledge. Beyond the basics of reading and math learned in elementary school, most of the more advanced subjects after that are quickly forgotten because, well, quite simply, there's no use for them. Most people will never use Pythagorean's theorem or have to know what year some obscure country from 5,000 years ago rose to power. So if most people forget most of what they learn in school, because most of what they learn they simply never need in life, then is forcing our children into 12 years of school with the addition of Ritalin to help them focus really a good idea? And don't forget, Ritalin is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, meaning it increases dopamine in the brain. Cocaine operates the same way. We are essentially giving children cocaine in order to get them to do well in school. This means children can't do well in school until we turn them into crackheads. You see, the problem here is that we don't even want to consider, for a moment, that the problem might be school, which, ironically, is now being defined as one of the leading causes of the diagnosing of ADHD in the first place. Stephen P. Hinshaw, Ph.D., and Richard M. Scheffler, Ph.D., professors from the University of California, have published the findings of new research in a new book titled The ADHD Explosion. In it, they show how school policy is the leading cause of ADHD diagnosis, calling it, quote, the closest thing to a silver bullet. In essence, these researchers from the University of California found that because the school system urges teachers to turn out better graduation rates and test scores in order to get funding, they are then incentivized to have children diagnosed and treated. Drugged up kids who are medicated in order to focus on boring, useless schoolwork can get better grades, which means more funding for schools. In the name of money, teachers, schools, and psychiatrists are converging to drug up innocent children by convincing well-meaning parents that their children have an internal psychiatric learning disorder that can be summarized as nothing more than being bored by a school system that has little relevance to anyone's future. At the end of the day, this is about finding out what the actual problem is. Are children, with their excited, curious, and open minds, fundamentally flawed from within? Or are schools, with their outdated models, authoritarian controls, and often useless learning curriculums, flawed from within?